In the dense, untamed woods at the edge of town, where the trees stood like ancient sentinels and the wind whispered secrets in forgotten tongues, there was a door. It stood alone, impossibly upright, unconnected to any structure, unclaimed by time or decay. Weathered oak, blackened iron hinges, and a tarnished brass handle, simple, unassuming, and yet deeply wrong. The ground around it was barren, as if the earth itself refused to grow near it. No footprints in the soil, no claw marks from wandering animals. It simply stood, waiting. Elias Crow had first heard about the door as a child, a hushed legend among the older kids meant to keep the younger ones from straying too far into the woods. The door without a house, they called it, and if you knocked 3 times, something on the other side would knock back. But no one ever dared. Until now. Elias had spent the last 15 years away from Hollowbrook, building a life far from its peculiar folklore. Yet, when his mother passed, the duty of sorting through her belongings fell to him. It was supposed to be a short visit, a week at most, yet something had pulled at him, an invisible thread tugging him back into the woods he had avoided since childhood. The town had changed little in his absence. Same weary buildings, same faces carved by the passage of time. But there was something else, something unspoken in the way people averted their eyes when he asked about the woods. When he mentioned the door, the air seemed to tighten, the conversation always shifting before any real answers could surface. So, on the 3rd night of his return, armed with nothing but a flashlight and the reckless curiosity of a man who had spent too long ignoring his past, Elias ventured into the woods. The path was exactly as he remembered it, crooked, overgrown, and unwilling to reveal what lay ahead. The deeper he went, the more the sounds of the world seemed to dim. Crickets fell silent. The rustling leaves stilled. Even his own breathing felt muffled. Then, he saw it. The door stood precisely where it always had, unchanged by the years. His pulse quickened. He told himself it was just an old legend, just an anomaly left behind from some long-forgotten structure. But something in the air suggested otherwise. He hesitated, then, almost instinctively, reached out and ran his fingers over the wood. It was cold. Too cold. The stories of his youth echoed in his mind. Knock 3 times. Elias drew in a slow breath. His hand hovered over the door. His heartbeat drummed against his ribs. And then, knock, knock, knock. The sound barely left his knuckles before a response came. A deep, hollow knock from the other side. Elias staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. His flashlight flickered. The air around him seemed to press inward, suffocating. The brass handle turned. And the door without a house, creaked open. Elias stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The door had opened, slowly, deliberately, revealing nothing but darkness beyond its threshold. Not the darkness of an empty room, nor the muted black of an abandoned house. This was something else. A void. A depthless expanse that swallowed the light of his flickering flashlight before it could touch anything inside. The air beyond the door was colder than the night around him. It carried no scent, no sound. Just a vast, heavy silence. His instinct screamed at him to run, to leave the door as it was and never return. But something stronger, something ancient, almost familiar, kept him rooted to the spot. And then, from the darkness, a whisper. Elias. His name. The voice was neither male nor female, neither near nor far. It did not echo, did not belong in this world. It was a whisper spoken directly into the marrow of his bones. He staggered back, his breath a sharp hitch in his throat. His flashlight wavered in his grip, shaking as he fought the primal fear clawing its way up his spine. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, ever so faintly, the sound of footsteps. Not approaching, just shifting, adjusting, as though something within the darkness had only just noticed him. His breath came shallow and quick. The door, impossibly standing on its own in the middle of the woods, now felt like an open wound in the world, a portal to something not meant to be seen. He should leave. He should. A gust of wind surged from within the doorway, slamming into him with enough force to knock him back a step. The scent of damp earth and something metallic flooded his senses, like rain on old iron. The door creaked wider, the darkness pulsing, alive. Then, in the corner of his vision, something moved. Not in the doorway. Behind him. Elias spun around, his flashlight catching the silhouette of a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated. The light barely seemed to touch it, as if its form resisted being seen. Its head tilted, an unnatural movement, slow and deliberate. Elias couldn't breathe. His body refused to move. Then, the thing in the trees took a single step forward. The ground beneath Elias trembled. The wind surged again, this time dragging him toward the open door. His feet scraped against the earth as he fought against the pull, his fingers clawing at the air for anything to hold onto. But the door was hungry, the darkness insistent. The last thing he saw before he was yanked inside was the figure standing at the tree line, unmoving, watching. Then the door slammed shut behind him. The slam of the door echoed through the void, reverberating into nothingness. Elias hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his bones. The breath fled his lungs as he scrambled to his feet, his hands groping the darkness for something, anything, to anchor himself. But there was nothing. No floor beneath him, yet he stood. No walls around him, yet he felt caged. The air was thick, pressing against his skin, humming with something unseen. His flashlight, still clutched in his trembling grip, flickered violently before dying altogether. Darkness swallowed him whole. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming fast and uneven. He turned in frantic circles, reaching out, but his hands met only empty air. The door, where was the door? He spun, desperate. The door had been right behind him. He knew it had. Yet there was no frame, no threshold, nothing but endless black stretching in all directions. Then came the sound. A slow, rhythmic creaking. Wood bending, stretching. Like the groan of an ancient house settling, but deeper. Closer. Elias swallowed hard. Hello. His own voice felt small here, swallowed by the vast nothingness. The creaking grew louder. It wasn't coming from the distance, it was circling him. Moving without footsteps. Shifting in the unseen. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to steady his breath. This isn't real. You're dreaming. Wake up. Wake up. But then, something breathed against his ear. A rush of cold air, the distinct sensation of something standing right there. Close enough to touch. Elias spun, his fist swinging wildly through the void, hitting nothing. His own ragged breath filled the space, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in the quiet. Then, just ahead, something shifted. A faint glow. It was weak at first, a pulse of dim, sickly light forming in the distance, barely enough to define shapes. But it was something. And Elias, desperate for direction, for escape, began to move toward it. Each step felt unsteady, as if the ground wasn't solid beneath him. The light pulsed again, brightening. He could make out the vague outline of something ahead, tall, skeletal shapes, unmoving in the gloom. Trees? No, not trees. He moved closer, and the truth crawled up his spine like ice. They were doors. Hundreds of them. Tall, narrow, old. Their frames twisted like skeletal remains, stretching up into the darkness above. Some stood alone, others clustered together like mourners at a graveside. And each one was closed. Elias's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a place. It was a labyrinth. A graveyard of forgotten thresholds. And he was trapped inside it. His breath trembled in his throat as he turned, searching for something familiar. The door he had entered from, his door, was nowhere to be seen. Only endless paths of standing doors, stretching into the void. Then, one of them creaked open. A sliver of light spilled from its crack, casting long, jagged shadows against the others. And from within, something began to step through. Elias took an unsteady step backward as the door before him creaked open. The light spilling from the crack was not warm or inviting. It was pale and wrong, flickering like candlelight submerged in water. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, bending in ways that defied logic. His breath hitched. Something moved beyond the threshold. A hand. Long fingers, unnaturally thin, curling around the edge of the doorframe. The skin was pale, no, ashen, like something that had not seen sunlight in centuries. The fingers flexed, their joints clicking as they gripped the wood. Then came the whisper. Elias. His name again, spoken with a voice that did not belong to any living thing. It was not a greeting. It was a knowing. A claiming. Elias stumbled back, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He wanted to run, but where? Every direction was the same, endless doors standing in a void of nothing. The door opened wider. A figure began to emerge. Its shape was human-like, but wrong. The body was too tall, its limbs elongated, its neck craning unnaturally as if testing the space outside. Its skin was grey and stretched too tight over its bones. No eyes. No nose. Just a hollow slit of a mouth that widened as it stepped forward. Elias turned and ran. His footsteps echoed through the vast emptiness, his breath ragged. The doors around him loomed, watching without eyes. Some shuddered as he passed, as if whatever lay behind them felt him moving through their domain. A deep, resonant boom reverberated behind him, the sound of the first door slamming shut. But Elias knew that thing, whatever it was, had stepped through before it closed. And it was following him. He didn't dare look back. He could feel it, the way the air shifted, the way the unnatural silence moved with him. It was keeping pace, waiting. Then, another door creaked open to his right, and another to his left. More slivers of pale light spilled into the void. More whispers slithered through the air. The sound of footsteps, many footsteps, began to fill the space. He was surrounded. Elias skidded to a stop, his body shaking. He turned in frantic circles, looking for any path that wasn't opening into more horror. The doors groaned wider, and shapes shifted beyond their thresholds. Then, just ahead, he saw it. A door that was already open. Not flickering with pale light. Not standing ominously closed. Just ajar, waiting. And unlike the others, it looked familiar. His door. The one from the woods. The realization hit like a lightning bolt. If he could reach it, if he could get back through, maybe he could leave this place. The whispers grew frantic now, the figures emerging fully from their doorways. Elias sucked in a sharp breath and sprinted toward the open door. The ground seemed to fight him, like running through water. The figures in the doorways turned their hollow faces toward him, their elongated hands stretching, reaching. The air behind him shifted. A rush of movement. Something lunged. Elias dived through the open door. For a split second, there was nothing. A cold, weightless void. Then, the sensation of falling. A rush of air. And the hard, unforgiving impact of the forest floor. Elias gasped, his lungs sucking in damp night air. His body trembled, aching from the fall. The scent of pine and earth filled his senses. He was back. The door without a house stood before him, exactly as it had before. Only now, it was closed. And something knocked from the other side. The knock sent a tremor through Elias's bones. It was slow, deliberate. The same 3 beats he had given before stepping into the void. Knock, knock, knock. He scrambled backward on his hands, his breath a sharp, ragged thing in his throat. The forest around him had returned, twisted trees, damp earth, the scent of leaves in the night air. But the silence remained, the kind that felt watched. The knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. Elias pressed a trembling hand against his chest, trying to steady the violent rhythm of his heart. He should run. He should get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But then, the handle turned. A thin, metallic click shattered the silence. The door didn't open, not yet, but the latch had given way. Something was trying to come through. Elias shot to his feet. No, 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 no. He lunged forward, gripping the brass handle with both hands, forcing it back into place. The cold metal stung against his palm. Whatever was on the other side resisted, pressing against the wood. He shoved harder. The pressure fought him for a moment, but then the force lessened. The presence withdrew, just slightly, like a beast retreating into the darkness of its cave. And then, a whisper seeped through the cracks. You left the door open, Elias. His stomach dropped. No. No, that wasn't possible. He had seen the door slam shut when he fell back into the woods. He had felt it. But the voice, It carried a certainty that sent ice through his veins. You left it open. And something followed you through. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, stiffly, he turned his head. The wood stretched around him, dark and thick. The trees swayed slightly in the night breeze, their branches shifting like grasping fingers. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among shadows, standing between two gnarled trees. But as his eyes adjusted, details emerged. Too tall. Too thin. Its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if testing its shape in this world. Its arms hung long at its sides, fingers twitching with something like anticipation. Elias's stomach churned. It had no face, just a hollow expanse where eyes and a mouth should be. And yet, he felt it looking at him. The wind picked up, rattling the branches. The thing didn't move. It only stood, watching, waiting. Elias backed away from the door, from the thing in the trees, from the impossible nightmare he had brought back with him. Then, the thing mimicked him. A single, slow step forward. Its movements were wrong, not fluid, not natural. Like a puppet dragged by invisible strings. Elias's pulse roared in his ears. He turned on his heel and ran. Branches whipped against his face, the forest blurring around him. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to put as much distance between himself and the door, and the thing, as possible. The ground sloped downward, his feet stumbling over roots and uneven earth. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Somewhere behind him, the door remained. And something had stepped through. Elias didn't stop running until the trees began to thin, the lights of Hollowbrook flickering in the distance. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, but he didn't dare slow down. His mind screamed one thing over and over. It followed me. The thought wrapped around his throat like a noose. He had escaped the labyrinth of doors, barely, but he hadn't come back alone. Something had stepped through. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. His mother's house stood at the end of the road, dark and silent. The sight of it sent a small wave of relief through him, a reminder of reality, of something solid. He burst through the front door, slamming it behind him, locking it out of instinct. Silence. Elias stood in the dim entryway, gasping for breath, trying to shake the weight of the woods off his skin. His ears strained for any sound beyond the door, any sign that the thing had followed him this far. Nothing. Just the empty hush of the house. He pressed his forehead against the door, his pulse still racing. Maybe it hadn't followed. Maybe it was still in the woods, lingering near the door, trapped between here and nowhere. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias froze. The sound had come from inside the house. Slowly, he turned his head, his breath shallow. The hallway stretched into darkness, unchanged, yet somehow different. The air felt heavier. The shadows stretched too long. He took a cautious step forward. Hello. Silence. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move through the house. Each room was as he left it, dusty, filled with relics of a life his mother had left behind. Nothing out of place. Nothing watching. His nerves screamed at him to run, to get out, but where would he go? There was no explaining this. No one would believe him. He stepped into the bathroom, gripping the sink as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked pale, shaken. His dark hair was damp with sweat, his eyes wide with exhaustion. Then, something flickered behind him. A shadow, shifting in the hallway. He spun around, his pulse spiking, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. The silence stretched. Too long. Too still. Elias turned back to the mirror, and the breath fled his lungs. His reflection was wrong. The man in the glass looked like him, same hair, same face, same tired eyes. But something was off. The edges of his mouth curled slightly, not quite a smile. His eyes, too dark, too deep, like wells that led into nothing. And worst of all, his reflection wasn't breathing. Elias staggered back, his heart slamming against his ribs. The man in the mirror tilted his head, his lips parting slightly as if about to speak. Then, a whisper, curling through the air like smoke. You left the door open, Elias. The mirror shattered. Elias stumbled backward, shards raining onto the sink and floor. His pulse roared in his ears as the pieces scattered, reflecting dozens of fractured versions of himself. Only now, in every jagged piece, his reflection was grinning. And in the hallway, unseen by human eyes, something stepped closer. Elias stood in the wreckage of the mirror, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The whispers from the shards had stopped, but the house was no longer silent. Something was breathing. Not from him. Not from anywhere he could see. But it was there, deep and steady, filling the space around him like an invisible tide. He turned toward the hallway, his fists clenched. "What do you want?" His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. The answer came as a soft, deliberate knock. 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 It wasn't coming from the front door. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the house. The sound slithered through the dark, echoing through the floorboards, through the very bones of the house. Then, a slow, creaking noise. A door was opening. But there was no door there. Not before. Elias's stomach turned to ice as the air in the hallway shifted, the shadows bending. A frame now stood at the end of the corridor, its wooden edges warped and splintered, like something ancient forcing itself into existence. And beyond the door, darkness. The same endless void. The same cold hunger. The other place had come to claim him. Elias staggered back, but his body felt sluggish, as if the weight of the void was already pulling him in. The breathing grew louder. The thing in the house, the thing that had followed him, was standing just behind him now. Close enough to touch. A voice, low and quiet, curled against his ear. "You were never supposed to leave." Elias spun, but there was nothing. Only the darkened hallway. Then, he realized. His shadow was gone. The air rushed out of his lungs. He looked down, horror blooming in his chest. The light from the hallway should have cast his shape across the wooden floor. But there was nothing. Something had taken it. Or worse, something was standing in it. A force crashed into him. Cold, overwhelming. Hands, too many hands, grasped at his skin, pulling, yanking him toward the open door. Elias fought, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. His screams came out as strangled gasps, his voice stolen by the air itself. The house began to vanish around him. The walls peeled away like paper, curling into the void. The floor splintered, giving way beneath his feet. And then, just as his body tilted forward, just as the darkness opened its mouth to swallow him whole, a new sound split the air. Another door. Not behind him. Not in the void. But in the house. The front door. Wide open. And standing in its frame, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights, was Elias. Himself. Whole. Intact. Standing outside the house, watching with calm, knowing eyes. The Elias inside the house gasped. His struggling stopped. His mind reeled. How? The Elias at the door tilted his head. A small, almost apologetic smile touched his lips. Then, softly, he said, "I left the door open for you." And he closed it. The house collapsed into the void. Elias fell with it, the cold swallowing him, the whispering voices rising in a deafening chorus. The last thing he saw was his own face disappearing behind the door, locking him inside the place he had never truly left. Then, silence. The night returned to Hollowbrook, quiet and still. The house no longer stood. The door without a house was gone. And somewhere, in the world above, a man named Elias walked home. But whether he had ever truly been Elias at all, no one would ever know. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.